This is United States History to 1877. Chapter 9. Democracy in America. In this lecture, you will learn how politics changed as more white men were allowed to vote, and how the growth of democracy increased the debate over how the nation should grow, and a series of compromises over slavery begins. Andrew Jackson leads a controversial presidency. Lastly, the economy collapses, changing again the political balance in the nation. In American history, democracy is seen universally as a good thing. For the Founding Fathers, however, democracy was dangerous and to be avoided. They believed that too much participation by the masses would undermine the public order. It would prevent the creation of a secure republic based upon private property and trade. Still, the people wanted a voice, and whenever they could vote, they showed up in large numbers. They demonstrated, they gave public speeches, they criticized their leaders and demanded change. Leaders learned to listen, or at least to pretend to listen. As democratic voices grew, so too did the debates over the growth of the nation. Regional or sectional views became defined: North, South, and West. Tensions erupted in the Missouri Crisis in 1819, when the first territory west of the Mississippi applied for statehood. This would tip the balance of power in the slavery debate. Expanding slavery had been a question the Founding Fathers had avoided, hoping slavery would die out as the country grew over time. If Missouri was to be a slave state, it would expand the terrible tradition, prolonging and growing the problem. Missouri already had 10,000 slaves inside its boundaries. Henry Clay proposed a compromise, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, in order to keep peace and maintain balance. Missouri would be a slave state, and Congress would create the state of Maine as a free state. This would keep the politics balanced, giving pro-slave and pro-free politicians the same number of votes in Congress. And as the country grew to the west, Henry Clay proposed that a line would determine new states as slave or free. Any territory north of the line would be a free state, and anything south of the line would be a slave state. The line was to be at 36 degrees 30, the latitude of the southern boundary of the Missouri state. Thomas Jefferson heard of this compromise and despaired, even though he was a slave owner himself. He had wished slavery to die out, avoiding violence over the institution and its crimes against humanity. He said, "I considered it at once the death knell of the Union." To him, the Missouri Compromise was the end of the experiment in freedom he had launched in 1789, and the start of a new nation where not all men were to be equal. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767. During the Revolutionary War, he was a child and was briefly captured by the British. As a young man, he lived in Tennessee, worked as a lawyer, eventually gaining election to the House of Representatives. During the War of 1812, he used his political connections to receive the rank of general and earned the nickname Old Hickory for his strong and unbending ways. His time as a military leader saw him hunting and killing Native Americans, even invading Spanish-controlled Florida. Native Americans in the Florida Territory protected runaway slaves, and Andrew Jackson sought to destroy the Seminole tribe for doing this. His men executed 270 runaway slaves in one raid. During the War of 1812, his army defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans, making Andrew Jackson a national celebrity. Losing to John Quincy Adams in 1824, he won the presidency 4 years later in 1828 as a leader of the common man. As a Southerner, he was expected to do away with the hated Tariff of 1828, called the Tariff of Abomination. Southerners hated the tariff because it made European goods more expensive, forcing them to buy cheaper Northern products. John C. Calhoun, vice president for Andrew Jackson, drafted a document called South Carolina Exposition and Protest, a document that called for the refusal to pay the tax. When Jackson learned that Calhoun had written this document, he became furious, as South Carolina declared the right to cancel or nullify any federal law they felt was wrong. Jackson called this treason and threatened to use the army to collect the tax. South Carolina backed down, but this was the start of the debate over states' rights and federal power. The nullification crisis would ultimately lead to the Civil War. As politics expanded, criticism grew to include the moral behavior of politicians. Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War, John Henry Eaton, had recently remarried a newly widowed woman named Peggy Timberlake. Gossip across Washington disapproved of Peggy Eaton, as she was called, greatly affecting Jackson's presidency. At one point, Jackson and his cabinet of advisors discussed the situation, protesting the Washington women who disliked Peggy Eaton. The moral politics of the day showed how women who could still not vote, but could still have an influence over the leadership of the country. Andrew Jackson's presidency was full of controversy. The biggest fight of his time in office was his war on the Bank of the United States. The bank was designed to stabilize the growing American economy, but it also made profits for wealthy investors. Jackson saw this profit as unfair to the common American. Jackson even blamed the Bank of the United States for causing the Panic of 1819, which destroyed the American economy. When Congress tried to renew the bank's charter in 1832, Jackson vetoed the bill. Jackson emptied the banks, sending the assets into state banks. Jackson's critics called these his pet banks. His supporters praised him as a hero of the common man. Jackson used his popularity to rename the Democratic Republican Party as Democrats. His critics founded a new party themselves, known as the Whigs. Meanwhile, the number of pet banks grew in number from 329 banks in 1830 to 713 banks just 6 years later. Along the way, the pet banks increased the number of loans given out. In 1836, the lending bubble burst. Land sales in the West dropped off and the economy collapsed. The Panic of 1837 destroyed the nation's finances. In some ways, the democratization of the nation's banks proved the fear of the Founding Fathers. In another way, Jackson's fear of banks created a wave of lending that proved his fear was well-founded. The Panic of 1837 led to a general depression. The amount of money in U.S. banks dropped by 40% from 1839 to 1843. The disaster of the Panic of 1837 helped to shift power away from the Democrats to the Whigs. They had criticized King Andrew for 8 years, and after he left office, the people seemed ready for a change. Even so, Democrat Martin Van Buren won the presidency in 1836, just before the economy collapsed. His presidency was dominated by dealing with the after effects of Andrew Jackson's financial plan and the destruction it caused in the economy. And Martin Van Buren was only able to serve one term because of what Andrew Jackson had caused. In 1840, the Whig Party nominated William Henry Harrison, who was also a famous Indian fighter, just like Andrew Jackson, having won a major victory at Tippecanoe, Indiana. To balance the Northern president, Whigs nominated John Tyler, a Southerner, as vice president. Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, easily won the election in 1840. Sadly, William Henry Harrison died suddenly after taking office. It is believed he caught pneumonia at his inauguration, dying 6 weeks later. Because of this sudden tragedy, John Tyler became president and spent 4 years in office, mostly fighting with his own Whig party in Congress, even vetoing most of their bills. The Whigs remained divided, even though they elected 2 more presidents after Tyler's failed presidency. More than anything else, racial inequality exposed the limits of American democracy. As property requirements for voting were eliminated, freed blacks in the North began to vote in large numbers. Northern governments soon passed racial restrictions on voting. Racial and ethnic tensions contributed to a wave of violence in American cities in the 1830s. In Philadelphia, white mobs burned black churches and homes. Across the country, audiences laughed to white stage actors wearing black face makeup, playing as silly or ignorant African Americans, naming themselves Jim Crow. They turned cruel stereotypes into one of America's favorite forms of entertainment. Debates about slavery reflected wider tensions in society. The ultimate question was whether American democracy had room for people of different races, as well as different religions and classes. Some people said yes, like the Female Anti-Slavery Society of Boston. Others, like the Democrats and the Whigs, said no. In this lecture, we learned about how politics changed as more white men were allowed to vote, and how the growth of democracy increased the debate over how the nation should grow and expand. Also, how a series of compromises over slavery began. Andrew Jackson's presidency was considered highly controversial, and that the economy collapsed, changing again the political balance. This has been United States History to 1877, Chapter 9, Democracy in America. Created with work from the American YOP, an open-source U.S. history textbook published by Stanford University, edited by Joseph Locke and Ben Wright, with comments and narration from myself, Tyler Rust, for History Dojo.